I never thought the deepest wound in my life would come not from strangers, but from my own flesh and blood. The day I walked into that lawyer's office, my hands were shaking, not because of fear, but because of betrayal. "Dad," my son sneered, "you're not getting a single penny from Mom's will. Nothing." The way he emphasized that word, it echoed in my heart like a cruel hammer blow. I stared at him. This boy I had raised with everything I had. This man who once clung to my hand as a child, now looking at me with eyes full of greed and hatred. And then the lawyer. Oh, the lawyer couldn't help himself. He let out a laugh. Not a mocking one, but the kind of laugh that hides a secret. A secret that would change everything. That laugh was the crack in the wall of lies. The proof that my son and my ex-wife's family had underestimated me. They thought I was old, weak, forgotten. They thought I'd just roll over and die poor while they danced on my grave with millions in their pockets. But they had no idea who I really was. No idea of the sacrifices I'd made. No idea that behind these old, wrinkled eyes still burned a fire of vengeance. So when my son spat those words, "You'll get nothing," he unknowingly signed his own downfall. Because from that day forward I swore they would all regret underestimating me. My name is William, and before all of this, before the betrayal, before the greed, before the millions, I was just a father. I didn't grow up with much. My own father died young, and my mother worked herself to the bone just to keep food on the table. Maybe that's why, when I became a father myself, I swore my son would never feel the kind of emptiness I once felt. When he was born, I remember holding him in my arms for the first time. He was so small, so fragile, and I whispered a promise into his tiny ear. "You will always have me, no matter what." Life wasn't easy. My marriage began to fall apart after years of fights, silence, and distance. My wife moved on, found wealth, found comfort elsewhere. But me, I stayed. I stayed for my boy. I worked long hours in the heat of construction sites, swinging hammers with blistered hands. At night, I'd switch jobs, fixing cars under the dim light of a garage lamp, oil soaking into my skin until I could barely scrub it off. I missed dinners, I missed sleep, but I never complained. Every paycheck, no matter how small, went toward my son's clothes, his school fees, his books. I patched up my own shoes with tape and glue so I could buy him new sneakers that made him smile. I'll never forget the nights I came home so tired I could barely stand, only to find him asleep on the couch, waiting for me with his homework spread out, hoping I'd help him before bed. And no matter how exhausted I was, I always sat down beside him, explaining math problems with heavy eyes and a hoarse voice, until he finally drifted off. There were times when the fridge was almost empty, and I would quietly drink water and eat a crust of bread so he could have a full plate. He never knew. He thought life was normal, but behind the curtain, every day was a struggle. Still, there were moments of joy. I remember taking him to the park on Sundays, the only day I didn't work. He'd run around with a ball, laughing, while I sat on the bench, aching all over, but smiling because his happiness was worth more than gold. On his birthdays, even if I had no money for fancy gifts, I made sure he had a cake. Sometimes it was just a small one from the corner bakery. But the look in his eyes when he blew out those candles, that was enough for me. I carried every burden in silence. When the divorce papers came, when my wife left with another man, when I lay awake at night in an empty bed, I told myself it didn't matter. As long as my son was cared for, I could endure anything. I never remarried, never looked for another partner. My life was simple. Work, provide, survive. I gave up dreams of vacations, hobbies, even friendships. My world revolved around one person, my boy. And for years, I believed that one day, when he was grown, he'd look back and understand. He'd see the sacrifices I made. He'd realize how much I had loved him, even when the world turned its back on me. But the cruelest truth in life is this: sometimes the very ones you love the most are the ones who hurt you deepest. The first blow came in a voice I thought I knew, like the back of my hand. My son's voice on the phone, thin and distant. "Dad," he said, as if clearing his throat, "don't bother coming to the estate meeting. You won't get anything." For a full second, the world stopped. I felt the floor tilt beneath me, though I was sitting in my own kitchen, coffee gone cold in my hand. "Excuse me?" I managed, my words like gravel. "You heard me," he said, sharper now. "Mom left everything to her new family. You're not part of that life anymore." Shock is a strange thing. It makes your mouth dry and your tongue heavy. I replayed the word nothing, as if it were a foreign coin, worthless and cold. I thought of the nights I stayed up counting pennies so he could have warm shoes. I thought of the promises whispered in a tiny hospital room. "After everything I did for you," I said, because I needed him to remember, to feel it hit him as it hit me. He laughed, a brittle sound. "Everything? Dad, you missed my graduations. You missed my games. You were always there, but not there. Mom gave me a life." There it was, the first cut. Abandonment framed as reason. His words turned my memories into arguments, my sacrifices into excuses. I told him about the nights I worked 2 jobs, about the bread I ate so he could have the last piece. He flicked the other end of the line like a fly. "You don't get to play the martyr now. We've moved on. Accept it." Sadness spread slow and heavy, a leaden cloak that smothered me. I sat on the edge of my bed and listened to the click as he hung up. That silence afterwards was worse than any insult. It was the sound of a life dismissed. The weeks that followed were a study in small humiliations. Invitations stopped coming. Birthday messages became perfunctory emojis from strangers. His photos on social media were captioned with laughter I had paid for in sweat. When I walked into the funeral, I expected cold shoulders. I did not expect the thin public politeness he gave me, a nod, a stiff hug, and then his back as he turned to mingle with the new family who had paved his way. At the lawyer's office, the real betrayal sharpened its blade. My son arrived with his suit pressed and his smile rehearsed, like a man who had already practiced victory. He sat across from me, not beside me. He never reached for my hand. He never called me Dad in front of them. "Sit down, William," he said, using my name like a stranger would. "Listen, you don't need to make this difficult." I blinked. "Make this difficult? I'm your father." He shrugged, the movement of a man shrugging off history. "You had your chance. Mom took care of the rest." The lawyer leaned forward and, God forgive him, laughed. Not to me, not a private chuckle, but a public soft laugh that held contempt like a glove. That laugh was a brand. It felt as if everyone in that room had agreed I was a relic, something to be forgotten politely. Humiliation rose hot in my throat. I felt like a museum piece, polished but useless. I tried to speak, to ask for explanations, anything. I dragged up names of contracts, old promises. They smiled, indulgent, as if I had told a child a tall tale. "You're getting nothing," my son said again, louder now, as if to punctuate the scene. "Nothing from her will. Don't embarrass yourself." Each repetition was a fresh strike. Disbelief sat heavy. My boy, raised on my laps, calling me an embarrassment. My chest tightened, and the old familiar ache of being erased began to bloom. I remember the taste of bile at the back of my mouth. My hands trembled. I thought of all the mornings I'd woken before dawn, of bandaged fingers and oil-stained shirts. "Is this how you thank me?" I asked, not sure whether I was pleading or accusing. He rolled his eyes. "We don't have to do this in front of everyone." He spoke as if cutting me out were a formality, a transaction already settled. Anger came afterwards, slow and flaring. It started as a flinch in my jaw and settled like a hard stone in my gut. How many times had I swallowed my pride so he could stand tall? How many nights had I given up heat so he could sleep warm? I watched him laugh with the others, a sound that used to melt my heart when he was a child, now a dagger aimed right between my shoulder blades. In that room, surrounded by whispered congratulations and clinking teacups, I felt utterly alone. Betrayal is rarely a single moment. It is 1,000 small usurpations, missed calls, cancelled visits, casual slights, that gather like storm clouds until the storm breaks. And yet this was worse. This was a final sealing, a public declaration that I was to be stripped of not just money, but legacy and dignity. As the last of them rose to leave, my son paused by the door and looked back once, cold and unrepentant. "Good luck, Dad," he said, the words a benediction of scorn. I left that office with my heart pounding and my mouth a desert. I would not let that be the last word. The shock had fractured into sorrow and then hardened into a quiet, burning resolve. The betrayal wasn't just about riches. It was about being erased, about a life's work turned into a footnote by the very man I had built it for. Their greed had given me a clarity I had never asked for. Pain stripped away the illusions, and what remained was the truth of who I had become, a man betrayed, and a man who would answer in kind. I walked out of that office like a ghost, the city noise muffled, as if someone had pulled a blanket over the world. My legs carried me, but my heart felt like it had been hit with a freight train. Every step was an echo of the word they had thrown at me: nothing. At home, I took off my shoes and sat on the edge of the bed, the cheap mattress sighing beneath me. The apartment was the same as always: a single lamp, a chipped mug on the table, a stack of unpaid bills. Grief came first. Thick, choking grief that tasted like iron at the back of my throat. I thought of the first time I'd held him, so small and warm, promising I would always protect him. How many promises had I kept? How many had I broken for his sake? I counted them like beads on a rosary, each one a small wound. Images crawled into my mind, his small hand in mine at the crosswalk, his graduation cap thrown into the air, the way he used to sleep with trust that felt like armor. That armor had been stripped in an instant. The thought of him calling me an embarrassment replayed in my head on loop, an ugly film I could not turn off. Sadness folded into disbelief. I kept expecting someone to wake me, a neighbor, a phone call, a miracle that would make it all a bad dream. But nothing changed. The silence was relentless. I stared at my hands, the calluses, the faint scars from years of woe. And for a moment I saw a stranger, a man who had given everything and received contempt in return. Anger arrived slowly, like a tide. At first it was a small ember beneath my ribs, a heat I could ignore. Then it grew, fed by memories of every sacrifice no one had thanked me for. I remembered nights I worked through fever so there would be money for his textbooks, mornings I left before sunrise so he could never know the ache of an empty fridge. Those memories hardened into something fierce. My chest felt tight. My jaw clenched until my molars ached. I paced the little room until the floorboards creaked like an old man coughing. Each creak was a drumbeat. Enough. I thought about the lawyer's laugh again, that soft, almost casual sound that declared me obsolete. How dare they reduce a life to a punchline? How dare they turn my years into a footnote? Something inside me shifted. Grief and disbelief coalesced into a razor-sharp focus. The world that had been foggy cleared like glass wiped clean. I could see the edges of things, the documents, the signatures, the gaps they'd assumed were empty. A memory surfaced. Paperwork from the divorce, a clause I'd once signed in a haze of exhaustion, a legal phrase I had not fully understood at the time. I had always relied on their kindness, their fairness. I had been naive. No longer. Naivety peeled away like old paint, and underneath I found resolve. I would not be invisible. I would not be mocked and discarded. I lit a cigarette, though I had given up smoking years ago, the flame tiny and defiant in the dark. The smoke curled up, and I watched it as if it held answers. My mind began to plan in small, careful steps, not violent, not foolish, precise. I would pull at threads, until the whole tapestry unraveled. I would let their own arrogance be their undoing. I thought about patience, about how I had cultivated it for decades. Carrying burdens quietly, now that patience would be a weapon sharp and cold. For the first time in years I felt a dangerous exhilaration. It wasn't joy. It was the clarity of a man who had been pushed to the edge and decided not to fall. I replayed every slight, every laugh, every turned shoulder, and I placed them like stones on a path that led to one place: reckoning. No, this would not be a drunken, blinding rage. It would be deliberate. It would be intelligent. I would use the law, the paper, the very reality they hid behind to expose them. I thought of my son's face the day he told me I would die poor. The contempt in his eyes had been a challenge, an accusation. He had called my future worthless. I would show that his present was built on sand. As night deepened, I sat at the little kitchen table and opened a drawer where I kept old receipts, faded envelopes, and the handful of documents I'd never thrown away. I smoothed them out with hands that no longer shook. My hands were steady now. The trembling had been replaced by a cold, unyielding purpose. I would learn every law, every clause, every loophole they thought were beyond me. I would find allies who understood the language of contracts and whispers. I felt the taste of bitter iron give way to something else, a hard, clean determination that settled in my bones. It was a kind of survival I had never known, not to live another day, but to reclaim the dignity they had taken. No more silent suffering, no more passive acceptance. If they had made me a footnote, I would become the headline. If they had laughed, they would listen. If they had written me off, I would rewrite the ending. And in the cold quiet of that small apartment, with the city lights blinking like distant stars, I spoke aloud for the first time since the funeral. Enough is enough! The words hung in the air, simple and absolute, and they felt like a promise carved into stone. I closed my fists and felt the weight of years of love, work, and pain compress into a single burning vow. They had stomped on me thinking I would stay down. They were wrong. I would make them regret the day they laughed. I would take back what was mine, not for the money alone, but for the respect, for the memory of the boy who once clung to my finger like the world depended on it. I would be patient. I would be clever. I would be merciless in my resolve. And when the time came, they would know the cost of underestimating a man pushed to his breaking point. I did not storm in like a madman. I sat, listened, and built a map, one careful step at a time. First rule: patience. Revenge rushed, his regret served cold. I would let them underestimate me while I did the work in the dark. I started with what I already had: a shoebox of old papers shoved into the back of a closet, divorce decrees, handwritten notes, faded receipts, an apology letter I never burned. I spread them across my kitchen table like a detective with a case. Piece by piece, a shape began to appear. Names, dates, phrases I'd skimmed and ignored when I was younger suddenly looked like clues. I made lists, not grand plans, small, methodical tasks. Copy that sheet, call that clerk, visit that office, find that signature. I wrote them down in a battered notebook and crossed them off with a tiny, private satisfaction. I called an old friend, Tom, a paralegal who had once helped me with paperwork for free because I'd fixed his truck. He didn't ask questions. He asked when. I told him now, quietly. He became my eyes in the courthouse. Next, I found a lawyer who didn't wear contempt like a perfume, not the one who laughed, but a quiet woman named Rivera who listened without pity and loved the law for its teeth. She read the documents and smiled in a way that made me feel less foolish. "There's more here than you think," she said. I learned to speak their language. Legalese was a new alphabet. Clauses, reversionary interests, contingent beneficiaries. Words that had once been intimidating became tools. Rivera taught me how to read a contract for the traps and the openings. I visited records offices at odd hours, posing as a retired researcher. I waited in lobbies until the clerks were done for the day, then struck up conversations that opened doors to forgotten files. I paid small fees, filed tiny motions, and watched as the paper trail revealed its secrets. I found a faded clause, something my ex-wife had signed in a bitter hour, promising to keep an agreement that, if unmet, would trigger payments. It wasn't obvious. It was the kind of thing only someone who reads slowly and remembers more would find. I was careful with money. I couldn't afford grand gestures, so I used what I had and what I could borrow discreetly. A modest loan from a credit union, Tom's occasional favors, Rivera's willingness to work for a retainer she said she'd take out of whatever we recovered. No flashy accounts, no obvious bank transfers that would alert vultures. Secrecy became my second skin. I opened a P.O. box under a name that sounded like any old man's name, hired a cell phone with cash, and communicated in ways that couldn't be easily traced back to me. My son already watched my every move. I would not give him the satisfaction. I recruited allies quietly. An accountant who smelled out odd transfers. A former bank clerk who remembered a deposit made in haste. Each person I met had a small piece of the puzzle and a reason to help. Some for gratitude, some for justice, and some for the quiet thrill of toppling a presumptuous heir. I practiced patience in public. I smiled at family gatherings when I was invited. I offered small compliments that felt like salt on a wound. I let rumors of my frailty grow louder while I was quietly cutting the roots beneath them. I planted small seeds. A question asked casually at the right time, a pointed remark about paperwork, a memory mentioned that prompted the right person to dig through an attic trunk. The smallest suggestion can send a mouse to a memory that leads to a vital letter. There were nights I sat up reading tax records until dawn, cross-referencing dates with bank ledgers. There were afternoons I sat in my car across from a courthouse, watching people leave, noting faces, overhearing names. I behaved like a patient predator who learned the schedule of his prey. I used my own history as camouflage. I let people see the tired hands and the humble apartment. They assumed I was defeated. In their hubris, they left doors open. I walked in. I never revealed the full plan to anyone. Even Rivera only knew what she needed to know to draft motions and subpoena documents. Tom handled clerical digs. The accountant traced money. Me? I stitched the pieces together. Sometimes the plan was simply to wait and watch, to observe how my son spent, who he trusted, what he boasted about. Vanity reveals more than a microscope. It showed me his weak spots, pride, impatience, the people he leaned on. Those became places to nudge. I learned to listen for the thud of arrogance in a sentence. When he boasted at parties about expected inheritances, I made sure a curious cousin or an old friend overheard the wrong detail and asked the wrong question later. Small discomforts seeded doubt. I falsified nothing. I would not stoop to lies that could backfire. My weapon was truth, found, polished, and presented at the right time. Truth that embarrassed, truth that unstitched reputations. I practiced restraint. There were moments I wanted to call him, to tremble with rage into the phone and let the world hear me break. I did not. Instead, I wrote everything down, conversations, insults, dates, a record that would be useful later. There were personal costs. I skipped nights out with friends who would have noticed my sudden interest in court paperwork. I lied about headaches and back pain to cover for my absences. Revenge asked for patience. I paid in quiet solitude. I rehearsed my demeanor. I would not be the angry old man when the moment came. I would be calm, almost benign. Nothing disarms better than the face of someone who appears to have forgiven. Let them think you are finished. That's when they let their guard down. Every so often, I allowed myself a small victory. A document found, a clerk's memory jogged, a bank record that placed money where it shouldn't be. Each small win was fuel. It kept me moving. Rumors began to ripple quietly through their circle. Innocent questions. A cousin asking about a clause. I watched how they reacted. I watched greed become anxious. It was working, but slowly. Too fast and they would hide the truth. Slow, and the cracks widened. I never let anger dictate the pace. The plan required cold decisions, when to strike, when to wait. I drew a calendar and marked the days not in red for revenge, but in black for logistics. Court filing dates, witness availability, bank holidays, timing matters. On rare nights, I visited the park where I'd once pushed a small boy on a swing. I sat on a bench and spoke softly, as if making a promise to someone who wasn't there. It calmed me. It tethered me to why I was doing this, not for spite alone, for dignity. The final part of the plan I refused to write down, the reveal. I kept that to myself like a card flipped face down. I wanted them to sweat, to twist, to imagine 1,000 possible endings. Let them fear possibilities. That fear would make them reckless. So I moved, step by slow step, a patient spider spinning silver threads. I cultivated allies, polished old papers, engineered small missteps from my son's camp, and kept my own life quiet and unassuming. And all the while, I smiled when they laughed at me. Let them. Their laughter would be the sound that led them into the trap. What I would do when the moment came, how I would lay the papers on the table and watch the truth, unravel their vanity, I kept as my last and sharpest secret. They thought they had written the ending. I'd been rewriting it, one slow, exact sentence at a time. Soon, very soon, they would read it aloud. The day I chose to act, I felt strangely calm, like a man about to finish a long job he had been working on for months. Everything unfolded the way I had rehearsed in the quiet hours, patient, surgical, relentless. First twist, a forgotten envelope. Rivera called me one morning with a breathless voice. "William, someone in the bank found an old beneficiary notice tucked in a file. It references a reversion clause and a dated signature." I remember the way my hands went cold and then steady. That envelope was the hinge. We subpoenaed the original account records and found a transfer that never matched any ledger my son claimed to control. Next, I planted a quiet question at the right table. At a charity dinner, where my son boasted of his expected fortune, I let a casual acquaintance, a retired estate clerk I'd befriended, overhear and ask about a clause by name. The man later came forward, curious, and that curiosity opened a locked drawer in a lawyer's office. People hate being obvious. They are brilliant at hiding under layers of arrogance. My son's arrogance was his blind spot. He'd boasted to the wrong relative, and that relative had a memory like a steel trap. She found a letter my ex-wife had written years ago. In it she hinted at worries about how her estate would be handled if certain promises were broken. The letters confirmed the legal trail Rivera had been stitching together. I used the media quietly. Not tabloids, but a respected financial journalist I'd encountered at a church bake sale. I fed him a story framed as a concern about elder promises. He sniffed it out professionally and asked questions that made a few of my son's allies uncomfortable. One of them slipped up and revealed a bank name. Then the twist that nobody saw coming. A forged signature. Our accountant traced a late-night wire transfer to a shell account. When Rivera dug into the paperwork, she found a signature on a codicil that did not match my ex-wife's handwriting. We hired a handwriting analyst. The analyst's report was polite and devastating. The signature bore traits inconsistent with her known hand. Who stood to gain from forging that note? The list of suspects was small. My son, his new stepfamily, and the laughing lawyer. I remember the look on my son's face when Rivera produced the analyst's report. Hope drained from him like water from a broken cup. But I wasn't finished. The real delight came when Tom, the paralegal, traced a pattern of small withdrawals and unusual account activity that coincided with nights my son said he was studying or at work. It suggested not only entitlement, but active siphoning. We subpoenaed phone records and found texts that read like instructions. "Move it tonight. Don't ask." The text matched his number. At the public hearing, I walked in with papers stacked high and a calm I'd forged over sleepless months. My son's smugness wavered when Rivera, with the kind of focus that made people nervous, placed the photocopies on the table and slid the analyst's report across to the judge. "Your Honor," she said, "we have a binding agreement that triggers reversionary payments, a suspicious codicil with a forged signature, and bank transfers suggesting wrongful diversion of estate funds." Murmurs ran through the room like a current. My son rose, voice tight. "This is," he began. "That is forgery," Rivera interrupted, steady as winter. "And we have a witness who can place those instructions to move funds in his messages." She held up the phone records. The judge read. His face shifted from curiosity to severity. Then the twist that would humiliate them more than anything, a recorded voicemail. "In the months I was building my case, I'd convinced an estranged cousin, one who'd been fed half-truths by my son, to share an emergency voicemail he'd received months earlier. In it, my son's voice was urgent. 'Get the transfers ready. Make it look like standard operating.' He sounded scared, not smug. It betrayed panic and intent." The room leaned in. My son's hands shook. The laughing lawyer, who'd once dismissed me with that soft chuckle, turned a sickly color. He fumbled for explanations that sounded hollow under Rivera's scrutiny. Another surprise unfolded when a distant relative produced a storage box with my ex-wife's original deeds and a sticky note indicating conversations she'd had about protecting certain assets for her first husband, for me. It wasn't greedy paperwork, it was evidence of intention. One by one, their stories unraveled. Bank managers testified about irregularities. The handwriting analyst explained the discrepancies. A compliance officer confirmed the shell account was set up with forged documents. People I'd once thought unreachable, clerks, accountants, a cautious bank manager, spoke up when they realized a fraud had been attempted. They had the law on their side, and the law, when it meets truth, is relentless. My son's friends drifted away in whispers. The step-family's glossy facade cracked. The lawyer who'd laughed? He was cited for misconduct, and a referral was made. His reputation, the only thing he'd called on to laugh, began to crumble publicly. People don't just lose money, they lose faces. There was a moment when my son stood in front of me, defeated and raw. "Dad, I didn't," he started. His voice broke under the weight of what he'd done and the weight of what he'd lost. I felt something complex then, not joy exactly, but release. Years of muted anger poured out like floodwater. "You told me I'd die poor," I said quietly. "You said I was nothing." He swallowed. You thought you were entitled," I finish. "Down. You thought forgiveness was a currency you could spend." The legal consequences followed: restitution hearings, contempt, and charges for forging legal documents. My son faced penalties that matched the gravity of his actions. The step-family tried to sue for slander and lost. The court found their claims were founded on the very lies they tried to build. I did not celebrate with champagne. I watched the justice unfold like a slow, necessary winter. I watched their faces in court as friends stopped answering their calls. I watched them learn a lesson I had learned the hard way: that greed makes liars of good people and cowards of the brave. There was a final twist, small but perfect. A sealed letter my ex-wife had tucked away for me to be opened only if necessary. She'd feared this exact scenario. She had left instructions for me to be contacted if certain conditions weren't met. The letter read, not with anger, but with apology, and an explanation of why she'd made the choices she did. It said, she had always remembered me, quietly, imperfectly, painfully. That letter changed nothing of the legal facts, but it gave me something else: closure. It made the revenge not merely about money, but about truth being acknowledged. In the end, the betrayers were exposed publicly and punished proportionally. My son lost prestige, legal standing, and the illusion that money could erase what he'd done. The lawyer lost his license. The step-family retreated into private shame. I walked away with compensation that repaired my life, and more importantly, with the knowledge that the truth had been revealed. They had tried to write me out of history. I had rewritten the page, slowly and with care. When I left the courthouse, the sun felt ordinary and kind. I held my head a fraction higher than before. The plan had worked, not because it was cruel, but because it was right. They had thought themselves untouchable. They were not, and the quiet man they'd dismissed had the last word. When the dust finally settled, I found myself standing in a life I recognized. For months I had lived with nothing but fire in my chest, a fire fueled by betrayal, humiliation, and rage. Now, all at once, that fire was gone. I won. The courts had spoken. The truth had been dragged out into the open like weeds ripped from the soil. My son was no longer the golden boy everyone believed him to be. He stood disgraced, his arrogance shattered, his future scarred by the stain of his own greed. The lawyer who once laughed at me lost his license and the respect of his peers, and the so-called step-family? They slithered back into the shadows, no longer bold enough to show their faces. I had achieved what I set out to do: justice, revenge, closure. And yet, standing in the quiet of my home one evening, I realized something. Revenge doesn't heal the heart, it only balances the scales. I looked at the photographs on my mantelpiece, old pictures of me and my son when he was small, when his smile was pure, when his tiny hand fit perfectly into mine. I remembered the promise I whispered to him at birth. You will always have me, no matter what. The words tasted bitter now, like a promise broken not by me, but by him. The truth is, victory came with a cost. My trust was gone. My son and I were no longer father and child. We were strangers bound by blood, but divided by betrayal. I mourned that loss more deeply than I celebrated the money or the legal triumph. But I also felt something else. Relief. Relief that I was no longer a fool in their story. Relief that my sacrifices had finally been acknowledged, if only by the law. Relief that I could live the rest of my days with my head held high, knowing I did not let lies bury me alive. I started to find small joys again. Morning walks, tending to my garden, sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee as the sun rose. For the first time in decades, I wasn't working myself to death for someone else's comfort. The wealth that had been hidden from me was finally mine to use, not for greed, but for dignity. Still, when people ask if I am happy, I pause. Happiness is complicated when it comes with scars. What I feel is peace, the kind that comes only after surviving a storm. And if there is one lesson I want the world to take from my story, it is this: betrayal cuts deepest when it comes from the ones you love, but justice has a way of finding its path if you have the courage to fight for it. Family is not blood alone. Family is loyalty, respect, and love. Without those things, even the richest inheritance is worthless. Greed may blind people for a time, but the truth has a way of laughing last. And so I stand here, not as a broken old man, but as a survivor who refused to be erased. They tried to silence me with lies and greed. Instead, my voice, my truth, is what ended them. That is the legacy I will leave behind.